so all throughout my life, I've been attracted to these unlikely alliances of Wisconsin Ojibwe and white fishers who had battled over treaty rights and yet came together to protect the fish from mining, ranchers and farmers in South Dakota and Nebraska, who had been at odds over natural resources, but came together to stop the Keystone XL pipeline in the Pacific Northwest. Some of the fishers, some of the local communities that had been at odds with the tribes over fishing rights came together to protect the same fish from the threats of oil trains, coal trains, pipelines. And so the idea that the land and water in the process of protecting it can bring together people, to me, has been very encouraging. And I've seen some of these communities, some of these individuals change through time in ways that perhaps weren't expected. The idea was to replace that far-right racist populism with more of a cross-cultural, multicultural, anti-corporate populism. And what was remarkable is that in many ways it worked, because at the same time mining corporations were coming into northern Wisconsin, the same place where these battles were taking place, where the mobs were throwing rocks and bottles, there was sniper fire, and some of those hardcore militants obviously never came around, but some of the white rural residents who had been attracted to that message or were genuinely scared that the fish were going to disappear because the Ojibwe were spearfishing, some of them started to realize, wait a minute, these mining companies are coming in and they're the real threat to the fish. So instead of fighting over the fish, maybe we could come together over the fish and protect the same ones we had been fighting over. And there was an incredible alliance built in the mid-1990s between Ojibwe, Menominee, a couple other tribes, and some of the white sport fishers and local environmentalists in these small towns in very conservative areas of northern Wisconsin. And they stopped some of the world's largest mining companies, Exxon, Rio Algam, BHP Billiton, from putting in a couple of very large mines, in particular the Crandon mine, which was initially a project of Exxon near the Mole Lake, Secaucus, Chippewa community, and upstream from the Menominee Nation on the Wolf River. So some of the trout fishers, non-native trout fishers on the Wolf River, joined together with those tribes, where there had not been a very close history of cooperation. There had been a lot of conflict. And so this was really, really encouraging, taking what I saw in the Black Hills Alliance, the alliance between the Lakota and the white ranchers, and taking it to an even higher level. You could really stop these corporations through this kind of populism from below in ways that the mainstream environmental, largely white urban organizations could not do, because they couldn't go into a place like Rhinelander, Wisconsin, or Aberdeen, Washington, and say, hi, we're environmentalists, we're here to help, because a lot of the rural white population, and even some of the native population, don't really identify with that kind of big green philosophy, and see it as just kind of people wanting to have recreation in rural areas, not caring about jobs. And so it's been really encouraging to see that same kind of pattern here in the Pacific Northwest, in a place like Grays Harbor County, in which, that was the scene not only of a lot of the fish wars during the 60s and 70s, but the spotted owl wars between labor and environmentalists in the 1990s. You would think that that would be one of the toughest places to form an unlikely alliance of tribes, environmentalists, and some of the people who have been, their livelihood has been reliant on natural resources, on natural wealth for, their whole lives or their families' lives. But with the leadership of the Quinault Nation in Grays Harbor County, a very strong movement came out against the building of 3 oil terminals in Aberdeen, Hoquiam, and which would have brought in these Bakken oil trains from North Dakota, which are exploding all over the place. And so to see this county, which initially voted twice for Obama and then voted for Trump, right, to see a really strong grassroots, locally based native, non-native alliance stop this huge project because they cared about the land, they cared about the water, they cared about the salmon, they cared about the birds, and they cared about their local economy not being dependent on resource extraction, but wanting to build something different, something more sustainable, something more regenerative. Some of the places where the fish wars were the most intense was where the anti-mining, anti-oil grassroots alliances were the first to form and were the most successful. And I think that's because the conflict actually educated non-natives about the values of treaty rights, how it protects the land and water not only for native people, but for everyone. That treaty rights are good for everyone. And I think that's the lesson that came out of some of those conflicts, is that people learned. And then people realized they could only do it together with their neighbors. And I just find that some of these tribally led alliances that bring in the people who have the strongest attachment to the land, bringing in some of the people whose relatives came later, but who still care, and whose relationship to land isn't as deep, but they want to protect it for their future generations.